have a bit of a headache, or maybe even stomach cramps, or just maybe you're a little anxious. So you open your family's medicine cabinet, looking for something to relieve your discomfort. It smells faintly sweet, chemical, almost metallic. The hand-labeled bottles gleam in the lamplight like gems. But what's different about this cabinet is that it's filled with things that could end your bloodline before breakfast. And the wildest part, 19th century doctors believed they were healing you. Chloroform was sold in pharmacies like essential oils. People kept it next to their bed casually for headaches or tooth pain. One deep inhale too many, you wouldn't wake up. This was considered a household item. Lead and mercury ointments were skincare. If your complexion looked dull, don't worry, mercury could brighten it right up. It also brightened your path to kidney failure, neurological collapse, and teeth that fell out one by one. But at the time, that was considered cosmetic progress. For stomach issues, there were arsenic tonics. Microdoses of arsenic were believed to strengthen the constitution, meaning they had benefits to improving someone's overall physical health, vitality, and resilience. It literally rots the lining of your stomach. But Victorians swore it gave them energy. Some even ingested arsenic wafers or a complexion wafer for weight loss and blemish removal. Except you were slowly poisoning yourself to death. Opium. Drops, syrups, powders, whatever your heart desired, as long as your heart kept beating. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for mothers was basically a morphine-laced knockout serum for children. Parents used it in the same way we use melatonin gummies today. Except that melatonin doesn't stop your child's breathing. Cocaine. Hospitals used it in the way elementary schools use antibacterial wipes. Have a toothache? Cocaine. Your kids won't sleep? Cocaine syrup. Feeling anxious, depressed, coughing, or just even a little annoyed? Cocaine was the cure. Long-term use caused paranoia, delusions, insomnia, and violent behavioral mood swings. But doctors still proudly wrote articles about how remarkably effective it was. And then, tucked in the corner is a little brown bottle labeled simply Potassium Bromide. Doctors called it a cure-all tonic for nerves, a remedy for sleeplessness, irritability, and anxiety. But what it really did was make people quiet, compliant, and numb. Every dose slows the firing of neurons, deadening the edges of thought. Sensory input dulls, appetite shrinks, hormones collapse, all while the mind softens into compliance. And there's a word for the effects of long-term use: bromism. It starts with a little fatigue, foggy mind, but then the body begins to change. The skin shifts to this grayish purple tint, like bruises blooming from the inside out. Deep, painful acne erupts across the face and body, boils that ooze and scar because the body can't heal itself anymore. Then the eyes don't track right. They drift, slow and unfocused, like the thoughts behind them are stuck in molasses. Speech falls apart too. First a slur, then a mumble, then nothing at all. The hands never stop trembling. Even at rest, the fingers twitch in tiny rhythmic shakes, like the body is trying to shiver something out. Muscles weaken, walking becomes unsteady, legs buckle at random. And the sleep? That's the worst part. 14, 16, sometimes 20 hours a day of sleep. Not real rest though, more like half submerged in exhaustion, drowning in it. Memory goes next. Names slip away, days vanish, food stops being appealing. Weight drops fast, and the body hollows out, cheeks sinking, ribs sharpening, and the breath develops this chemical, almost rotten smell that's impossible to ignore. Everything slows. Reactions, emotions, the person becomes ghost-like, quiet, compliant, drifting through the room like they're underwater. Bromide was the perfect tool for anyone who wanted control without ever raising a hand. You just needed a bottle, a cooperative 19th century doctor, and someone with intentions dark enough to hide behind care. You didn't need a weapon. Bromide was an invisible set of handcuffs. Welcome to part 2 of Blanche Monnier's story, the young woman who didn't disappear. She was chemically erased. In part 1, we stepped behind the Monnier family's perfect exterior, and we saw the truth. A mother who orchestrated every detail of her children's lives, like a puppet master pulling strings. A home designed not for love, but for status. A childhood where Blanche's wants, needs, and voice never came first. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, stop. Go back now. Because those first 25 years of domestic control, they weren't just backstory. They were the blueprint. What happened to Blanche wasn't a sudden snap or a moment of madness or a desperate family trying and failing to care for a mentally ill daughter. It was an outcome engineered slowly, quietly, and deliberately. A crime built brick by brick, long before Blanche ever disappeared. So let's rewind. But before we do that, I just want to make something crystal clear because there are 3 names in this story that could easily get confused. And let's not do that. We have the de Marconnets, Louis and Louise. They're married to each other. And they have a daughter who they also name Louise. So Louise de Marconnay is Blanche's grandmother. And Louise Monnier, that's her married name, is Blanche's mother. Louise D gives birth to Louise M, who gives birth to Blanche. Just so we're super clear on that, or super cloudy. Now, it's 1869 and Blanche is 20 years old. She's been out of school for a while now, trained in all the ways a proper young woman should be. Sit straight, smile politely, and never ask for more than you're given. But here's the thing, Blanche hated being home. Her grandmother, she adored Blanche and wanted to protect her. Her mother, she resented deeply. It makes sense that Blanche avoids home whenever she can. So where did she go? The Poitiers courthouse. Grandmother Louise and Blanche spent their afternoons watching trials unfold. Criminal trials were public spectacles, real-life drama where the stakes were life and death, and everyone wanted a front row seat. Judges just didn't preside, they performed. Merciless inquisitors who could eviscerate a defendant with a single question. Defense lawyers? They were artists, master of the tearful plea, the dramatic pause, the performance so devastating it could make a hardened jury weep on command. For the working class, trials were a cheap entertainment, a way to escape the grind and watch someone else's world burn. For the bourgeois, it was a moral safari, a chance to clutch their pearls, grasp at depravity, and feel superior, all from a safe, elevated perch where their own sins would never be examined. It was nearly impossible to get a seat, though. You needed connections, bribes, and sometimes maybe even a little under-the-table persuasion. Because French trials weren't just an obsession, they were an addiction. People packed the courtrooms like we pack movie theaters today. This was really their true crime podcast, their Netflix, their binge watching, their reality TV, all rolled into one explosive, chaotic spectacle. And Blanche and her grandmother, they had season tickets. One of the trials they attended featured a defense attorney from the renowned firm Jacob Calmeil and Son, a name that carried serious weight in the provincial courts. The firm's patriarch, Jacob Calmeil, had been elected chief advocate 4 times between 1831 and 1865, cementing his reputation as one of the legal profession's most respected figures. Basically, he was a pretty big deal, locally anyway, and there, standing at the defense table, was Victor Calmeil, Jacob's son. Trained in the shadow of France's most respected legal dynasties, his father, learning the craft where prestige and power met the courtroom. And imagine you're Blanche for a moment. You're 20 years old. You've spent your entire life being told what to do and who to be and how to sit, smile, and stay silent. You've been molded, managed, and monitored since birth. And then you see Victor. He's handsome, yes, but it's more than that. He's confident in a way that feels magnetic. He works at one of the most prestigious law firms in Poitiers, the kind of place people mention with reverence. He's smart. He's respected. And he carries himself like someone who actually has agency over his own life. And for Blanche, who has never had a single choice that was truly hers, Victor isn't just attractive. He's everything she's been denied. He represents possibility. A future where maybe, just maybe, she could be seen more than just Louise Monnier's daughter. Where she could be loved for who she is, not controlled for who her mother wants her to be. So when prestigious Victor shows interest in her, Blanche doesn't just like him, she falls hard. But here's the thing about prestige in the 1800s. It didn't equal wealth, not even close. Many provincial lawyers were admired, respected, even revered, while caring very little, especially if they weren't partners or if the firm's income was inconsistent. And Victor, he wasn't the patriarch of the firm. He wasn't the partner or the one clients sought out, but rather just the son, still building his career and proving himself. In many firms back then, the younger generation started with nothing, no personal income, no inheritance, no ownership stake, just massive financial dependence on their father and the hope that one day maybe they'd make it. And Jacob being chief advocate, that didn't mean he was rich either. It meant he was respected in legal circles. It meant people knew his name, but prestige doesn't pay the bills. So here's the reality. Victor worked at a respected firm and was technically broke. In the 1870s bourgeois worldview, the world Louise Monnier lived and breathed, Victor was penniless. It didn't matter that his family had a reputation. What mattered was that he didn't have property or dowry potential, personal income, no obvious upward mobility or personal connections. So by Louise's standards, Victor had nothing to offer. But Blanche didn't care about any of that. To her, Victor was quietly magnetic, intelligent, passionate about his work, and she fell in love with him. By the time Blanche hit 21 years old, the whispers had already started. Neighbors swore she'd fallen into a secret romance with a young lawyer named Victor Calmeil. And by the next year, people claimed they'd spotted her slipping into his house more than once, but always with Marie Fazy trailing a careful step behind her. Now, having the family maid at her side wasn't strange at all. In households like the Monniers, a maid could double as a quiet sort of alibi, someone whose presence made a young woman's outings look respectable, even if she was really going to see a man she wasn't supposed to be seeing, a chaperone of type. And it became very clear very quickly that Blanche was not supposed to be seeing Victor. And I think you probably could guess by now why. Her mother, Louise, had a problem with it. Louise didn't just care about a man's intellectual merit or family prestige. She cared about money, personal wealth, social rank, inheritance, political connections that could elevate the family standing, of course. And Victor had none of that. So he wasn't just poor in Louise's eyes, he was beneath them. But Louise needed more ammunition than just, he's broke, Blanche. So she found it. First, Victor was 36 years old. That's a good 15 years older than Blanche at this point. And Louise clung to that age gap like it was proof of something sinister. 15 years, mon Dieu! Surely something inappropriate was happening. Surely this man was taking advantage of her innocent daughter. But let's remember and zoom out and look at the actual culture at the time. It doesn't hold up because in 19th century France, men marrying younger women wasn't shocking. It was practically the blueprint. Men were expected to spend their early adulthood building stability, earning a living, securing a profession, proving they could support a household. And women, of course, on the other hand, were trained for one thing, becoming the perfect wife. So age gaps weren't red flags. They were normal math. A man in his late 30s courting a woman in her early 20s, society barely blinked. So why did Louise treat this like a scandal? Because the age gap wasn't the real issue, of course. It was a convenient excuse, a distraction, a straw she was grabbing at to hide the actual problem for her. If Blanche was going to marry an older man, he needed to bring something substantial to the table. Wealth, status, a solid dowry that would secure the family's future. And poor in-law Victor, he didn't have any of that. He had the name of a respectable legal family, sure, but not the financial weight that Louise demanded. No portfolio or guaranteed future, land inheritance, nothing. Prestige without profit. And that was absolutely worthless to Louise. Additionally, under the Napoleonic Code, a husband automatically assumed half of his wife's legal responsibilities. By law, Victor would gain access to Blanche's paperwork, her inheritance, that is, the right to scrutinize every detail to safeguard her property and fortune. He would have power over her life in a way Louise never could control. So in Louise's eyes, this was not a good trade. It didn't justify the risk. And then there was the final insult. Victor wasn't just older, underfunded, and a threat to Louise's control over Blanche. He was a Protestant. Now let's talk about what that meant in 1870s France. For over 100 years, Protestants had been persecuted, forbidden from practicing their faith, denied civil recognition, and often forced into secrecy. Why? Because the Catholic Church wasn't just a religion, it was the backbone of French society. It dictated morality, social order, and the hierarchy of power. Catholics believed that God's law and the king's law were intertwined. Any deviation from that, like Protestantism, threatened that carefully ordered world. And Protestants represented change, secular ideas, the radical notion that authority and privilege, like the king, could be questioned. Napoleon officially gave Protestants legal recognition in 1802, placing them in the French religious landscape. But it wasn't full freedom. Their churches were regulated and pastors were monitored. The state had a say in how they worshipped. This made it easy for devout conservative towns like Poitiers to eye Protestants with suspicion and judgment. And to families like the Monniers, Protestants were both religiously suspect and political outsiders. Morally dangerous and a threat to centuries of tradition that kept them at the top. And yet, the Monniers attended the Protestant maid's wedding as witnesses. On the surface, that might look like a progressive gesture from an enlightened family. But this was the Monnier brand of kindness, a display of absolute control. By standing as witnesses for their maids, they polished their image as socially sophisticated elites while legally and socially stamping the servants' lives. Loyalty was sealed and secrets were bound, their obedience guaranteed. It was an absolute glaring hypocrisy. And these same Monniers who performed the sacrifice of witnessing Protestant servant weddings were outraged at the thought of Blanche marrying a Protestant lawyer. A servant? Acceptable, controlled, stage managed, easily owned. Servants were already beneath them. They knew their place. But their daughter? Unthinkable. A political and moral affront to everything Louise held sacred. The throne, the altar, and the rigid societal hierarchy that preserved her family's wealth and influence, really. It's almost like Blanche deliberately chose a man who represents everything her mother despises. Every single thing about Victor, his background, belief, status, is the opposite of what Louise would approve of. And whether Blanche realized it or not, that might have been part of the appeal. And it gets worse for Louise's ideals. Victor was also a Republican. Republicans were a living symbol of Enlightenment ideals, secularism, and the radical reshaping of society. A direct threat to the Monnier world, in other words. To Louise, preventing Blanche from marrying Victor wasn't just about her daughter's future, it was a defense of her entire way of life. A stand against revolution, chaos, and the audacity of love that darted across social, religious, and political boundaries. But here's the thing Louise truly couldn't grasp. Blanche didn't care. She didn't care about his religion, political affiliation, age, income, none of it. She cared only about him. And Louise only cared about herself, appearances, and she completely ignored what Blanche wanted and what Blanche's heart was saying. And this is all before Louise finds out about Blanche's nakedness.
My name is Theodore Touchard, and I need to tell you about the last time I saw Blanche Monnier alive. Well, not alive in the way you're thinking. She was breathing, walking, but something had already died in her. I'd known Blanche since she was a girl, laughing in our backyard, talking with my wife, playing with our children, bright, full of life, the kind of girl who lit up every room she entered. And then, one afternoon, I saw her walking into Victor Calmeil's house. Her maid Marie trailed behind her, close, protective, like she knew something terrible was coming. The whispers had already started by then. Blanche and Victor were engaged, or they wanted to be. But her mother, Louise Monnier, had other plans. Marie told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Blanche had even considered becoming a nun. A life of her own choosing, she said. If marriage to Victor was forbidden, perhaps God would be kinder than her mother. But Louise wouldn't allow that either. And after that day, there was no wedding, no convent, no Blanche. She vanished, not from the city, not from France, from sight. I never saw her again outside that house. But years later, I would hear her scream.
So Theodore never saw Blanche again outside the house after that day, but someone else did. And what they saw changed everything. One of Louise's maids came to her with something unusual. She'd seen Blanche standing at her bedroom window, naked. Now, Louise apparently didn't panic or gasp or faint as a proper Victorian lady might. No, Louise interrogated that maid like a detective. What exactly did you see? What time? How long? Who else saw? And then Louise gave the maid a new assignment. Watch Blanche around the clock and tell no one. 2 days later, the maid came back to report. And what she said was wild. Every single day, exactly 2 p.m, Blanche would drop a small letter from her window, a love letter. From across the street, Victor would sneak over, pick the letter up, and read it. And here's where it gets interesting. As Victor stood there reading her words, Blanche would stand at the window and perform for him, slowly removing her clothes, dancing, teasing, a private show just for him. And this was how Louise discovered the full extent of Blanche's affair. She realized that no amount of rules or locked doors or threats could keep them apart, and it infuriated her. But here's the question. Was Louise genuinely horrified by the sight of her daughter's body, or scandalized by the sexuality, or was this about something else entirely? Because in the conservative world of Poitiers, a daughter's body isn't her own. It's her entire reputation and honor and power. So to Louise, Blanche's secret performance wasn't expressions of love or desire. They were acts of war. And Louise, she was going to win this battle. So Louise is probably too embarrassed to think straight at this point, panicked and mortified. And she does what any respectable bourgeois mother would do when her daughter's behavior threatens the family name. She calls the doctor. Dr. Guernou isn't just some random physician. He's one of the directors of the local medical school. His word is gospel. And if Dr. Guernou says you're sick, you are sick. If he says you're insane, you are insane. No second opinions needed and no questions asked. Louise is convinced that her daughter's nakedness at the window signals a serious medical problem. So the doctor arrives, and here's what he does. Absolutely nothing. Louise paints the doctor a picture. Her troubled daughter, her concerns, her observations, and Dr. Guernou accepts it all without question. No examination of Blanche, no interview with her. Just Louise's word, which he treats like medical evidence, and boom, instant diagnosis of pernicious fever manifesting as excessive sexual excitement, exhibitionist disorder, and lust mania. Let's make sure we understand. A trained medical professional diagnosed a woman he had never examined based solely on her mother's account of what she saw through a window. Now, in 1870s France, the difference between Blanche's diagnosis wasn't just medical jargon. It was the difference between a temporary illness and a total moral failure, and it determines a woman's fate. The diagnosis of pernicious fever with excessive sexual excitement was the easy out for doctors and families alike. It meant that the woman wasn't bad, she was just sick. The symptoms of this diagnosis, like the sexual compulsion and the exhibitionism, it was all just terrifying symptoms of a physical disease. A fever, brain infection, blood gone bad. Her body was temporarily failing, but her soul might be salvageable. Treatment was possible, recovery was conceivable, and hope remained. But lust mania diagnosis, that was the death sentence for a woman's reputation. It condemned the patient's entire being. And for a tyrant like Louise Monnier, it was the perfect tool. Lust mania wasn't a symptom. It was a primary moral disease. Blanche wasn't sick. She was tainted. The sexual hunger, they called it, wasn't a byproduct of illness. It was the core of her sickness. A disease of the soul caused by hereditary rot, excessive passion, or personal corruption. For a woman, this diagnosis carried the immediate crushing shame of hysteria and sexual degeneracy. It wasn't just a medical label, it was a scarlet letter written in clinical language. And here's the thing. Blanche's diagnoses were not meant to be consistent. They were designed to be convenient. One of the most striking aspects of the 19th century psychiatry is how diagnoses often mix contradictory reasoning and medically unsound claims. In practice, these labels were less about treatment and more about control. When a woman's desires or behavior conflicted with family or societal expectations, her actions could easily be framed as a medical issue rather than, say, a personal choice. And it worked like this. Doctors could justify temporary confinement by citing fever or other physical conditions. If a family sought a more permanent solution, they could instead receive a diagnosis that focused on moral or psychological defects, effectively giving legal and social permission to restrict a person's freedom. In this way, medical language functioned as a tool of authority. It could validate the family's actions, limit the individual's agency, and ensure that social reputation remained intact. And all of this under the guise of professional judgment. And Dr. Guernou gave Louise exactly what she wanted. So what would your typical 19th century doctor prescribe for these diagnoses? For the fever, treatment focused on purging the physical malady. Doctors would try to break the fever using powerful and sometimes toxic medicines. They might apply leeches to the head to draw out the fevered blood, or prescribe harsh dietary regimes to starve the illness. And the dark hope was that if the fever broke, the excessive excitement would simply disappear. But Dr. Guernou, again, never speaking to or even seeing Blanche, prescribed 2 ice baths a week for her, supposedly hot blood. Ice baths. Every time Blanche was forced into the icy water, she screamed. And Louise, she threatened her, told her the police would be called if she didn't behave. The threats barely fazed Blanche, though. She knew, even then, that she was being manipulated. So Louise responded by keeping shutters and doors tightly closed, presumably to muffle the sounds from the neighbors. But some screams still escaped. They drifted into the streets of Poitiers, sparking gossip among neighbors, whispers and speculation as it goes, but never official investigation. The doctor also prescribed something else, potassium bromide. Now let me tell you about potassium bromide. In 1857, obstetrician Charles Lecoq noted the effects potassium bromide salts had on patients who experienced convulsions, such as those with what we now know as epilepsy. And I'm about to tell you what 19th century doctors thought caused epilepsy, because it really does have everything to do with what these male doctors diagnosed and prescribed to Blanche, but just prepare yourselves. Primarily during the 18th through early 20th centuries even, it was widespread within the medical community that excessive masturbation could cause epilepsy. But they didn't call it epilepsy, they called it sexual seizures. And bromide was used as a sedative due to its calming effects. But in cases like Blanche's, where a woman's sexuality was deemed excessive, it served a dual purpose: calm her down and kill her desire to fight. Dr. Guernou told Louise exactly how to do it. Mix the potassium bromide into sugar water, serve it to Blanche every single day. But don't tell her what it is. Call it a tonic, he said. Something harmless and healthy. Don't tell her it's medication or treatment. And definitely don't tell her it's a sedative. Why? Because if Blanche knew what she was drinking, she might refuse it. And again, think about that. A doctor, someone sworn to heal and protect and do no harm, was coaching a mother on how to drug her daughter without consent. Adult daughter, mind you. And Louise was careful with her husband Emile, too. She'd say tonic instead of drugs, medicine instead of sedative, because if her husband knew the truth, he might ask questions or demand a second opinion. He might make her stop or foil her plans in some way. Only the doctor and Louise knew. They kept everyone else in the dark, including Blanche, who had no idea what was being done to her. One crucially important note: potassium bromide has a long half-life, which means it doesn't leave your body. It accumulates, builds up, stays in your system until it reaches toxic levels. And when it does reach those toxic levels, the side effects would put any American pharmaceutical ad to shame. Bad breath, constipation, tongue disorders, mouth sores, loss of appetite, nausea, dermatitis, and other skin diseases, constant runny nose, mucus hypersecretion in the lungs, asthma, lethargy, extreme drowsiness, depression, loss of concentration, tremors, loss of muscle coordination, loss of body fluid, loss of reflexes, partial paralysis, anxiety attacks, paranoia, confusion, neurosis, aggressiveness, psychosis, clonic seizures, severe neurological dysfunction, cognitive impairment, loss of memory, cerebral edema with associated headaches and swelling of the eyes. And finally, after all that, semi-coma. And all of this led to one condition: cachexia. And cachexia means you are wasting away. You become thin, weak, and skeletal. And it's usually a term reserved for people debilitated with severe disease or cancer, people who are actively dying. This is what Dr. Guernou prescribed to Blanche every single day. It's 1872. The parish priest, Abbé de Montbrun, noticed something. Blanche wasn't coming to church anymore. And in a town like Poitiers and in the family of the Monniers, you go to church every week, no exception. So when Blanche suddenly stopped showing up, the priest noticed. And he asked Louise about it. Louise didn't hesitate. She had her story ready. "Oh, Father, it's so tragic. Blanche has come down with a terrible fever. Pernicious, the doctor says. She can't function. She can barely leave her bed." And the priest nods along sympathetically. "We're doing everything she can," Louise continues, and her voice is heavy with concern, as if she cares. "The doctor has her on long-term treatment plan." Louise said this like it was nothing, like she was talking about a cold, a slight inconvenience. "Don't worry, Father, we have a plan." But this long-term treatment plan wasn't about recovery. It was about containment, because Blanche wasn't getting better. She was being sedated and silenced, slowly erased. And Louise said it with a smile. The priest, he believed every word. Because why wouldn't he? Louise Monnier was a respectable woman, a pillar of the community, and a devoted mother by anyone's account. She would never lie, right? What about the lust mania diagnosis? Since the cause was a moral problem, the cure had to be punitive. A diagnosis of punishment, in other words. Patients with this diagnosis could be sent to asylums where the treatment wasn't really about healing, it was about breaking them. Step 1. Strip away all personal will. Force submission to institutional rules, no choices, autonomy, or voice. You weren't a person anymore. You were a problem to be managed. Step 2. Shock the system. And extreme cold baths were used like weapons. The belief was that you could literally shock the nervous system into submission, blast the desire out of you, drown the hunger. Step 3, starve the passion. Restrictive, bland diets designed to cool the passions and calm the blood. No flavor, no pleasure, no satisfaction. Because if you enjoyed anything, even food, you were feeding the disease. Step 4, lock them away. Long-term confinement. There was no cure or hope of recovery. The prognosis was poor. So the idea of a treatment plan with the goal of release just simply didn't exist. It really was erasure. A slow, methodical destruction of a woman, body, mind, and spirit, all under the guise of medicine. But Louise and Emile would not place Blanche in an institution. She got something worse. And to understand why Blanche was kept at home rather than sent away, you need to understand what asylums were like in 1970s France and what they represented to a family like the Monniers. Asylums weren't hospitals. They were prisons with a medical veneer, bars on windows, chains, restraints, patients confined indefinitely, and often forgotten by the world outside. In the second half of the 19th century, France, as in most of Europe, the so-called golden age of the asylum, I guess it's called, but there was nothing golden about it for people locked inside. And here's the thing, being placed in an institution wasn't about treatment like we have discussed before. It was about shame. Having a mentally ill family member was considered an acute source of embarrassment, like 24/7, and parents were often reluctant to make their child's disability or challenges public knowledge because of it. They preferred to keep them at home, hidden, rather than send them out to a nursing home for proper care. Why? Because sending them away looked like abandonment, like confinement, and a choice really only left to the severest of circumstances when the patient was a danger to themselves or others. But to Louise, Blanche wasn't dangerous. She was just inconvenient. So Emile agreed with Louise. They would leave Blanche at home. Though, knowing Louise, I don't imagine she gave Emile much of a say in the matter. He said himself, "As long as I can have her treated by doctors, I will keep her here." Blanche's doctors didn't interfere with the decision one way or the other. The effects of the bromide weren't well documented at the time, and as far as the doctor could see, it was sedating her. And as far as Louise could see, Blanche had stopped challenging her authority, so problem solved on both ends, really. Louise also argued that sending Blanche to an asylum would be expensive. And of course, Emile agreed with her on that too. Expensive and embarrassing. Two horrible things for this family, and it's best to keep it quiet. It's clear to me that even if these parents truly did believe their daughter was ill, their priorities were not in her well-being, of recovery, or even basic human dignity. Their priority was reputation, keeping up appearances. They hid the problem so no one would ask uncomfortable questions. And here's the disturbing part. No one did ask questions. I'm not saying it's right, but there were powerful social pressures in the 19th century France that kept people quiet, even when they suspected something was deeply wrong. Number 1, politeness and privacy were moral virtues. In bourgeois society, especially in provincial cities like Poitiers, discretion was considered a form of respectability. You didn't pry into another family's private matters, and if someone withdrew from society, the polite thing was to look away and not to ask why. Gossip might circulate quietly, but direct inquiry was taboo, especially when it involved a well-known, honorable family like the Monniers. Number 2, the home was a private moral domain. Middle and upper class French families treated what happened behind closed doors as off limits to outsiders, including neighbors and sometimes even the police. A family's reputation was everything. To question it was almost an attack. Number 3, gender and class made it even more untouchable. A bourgeois woman's behavior reflected directly on her family's honor. If a daughter disappeared, people might assume she had a scandalous affair, a mental breakdown, or even a shameful illness. Those topics were unspeakable in polite circles. People preferred to pretend she was away or, something else that didn't risk the family's name. The Monniers were a respected, educated family with legal and academic influence, so common townspeople and even acquaintances wouldn't have dared to challenge or question them openly. The class etiquette of the time demanded deference toward anyone of higher social standing. In short, by the social code of the late 1800s, not asking was the polite thing to do, even when something felt wrong. So, silence wasn't ignorance, really. It was intentional compliance with social etiquette. Everyone knew where the boundaries of good manners ended, and Blanche's name fell just beyond them. No one intervened. A more charitable assumption, maybe, if you're feeling generous, is that the Monniers thought they could give Blanche better care at home than in some sinister 1800s asylum. But let's be honest. Given the stigma surrounding mental illness in the 19th century France, it was hardly uncommon for insane relatives to be locked up in a cellar or attic so that they could be kept out of sight. Virtually every old family had a mad relative or two, so why should the Monniers be any different? And here's the legal kicker. According to Article 475 of the French Penal Code, the sequestration of a lunatic at home was not criminally reprehensible. It wasn't illegal, it was accepted. In fact, a detailed study of the 19th century French sequestration cases showed that confining the insane at home was mostly a prerogative of the closest kin. Parents were involved in more than half of the cases. It was a manifestation of parental and male authority. The number of sequestered women was almost twice the number of men, and it was usually a long-term strategy. In more than half the cases, the sequestration lasted for more than a year. And though Blanche showed no symptoms to suggest she was going mad, hardly anyone raised awkward questions when she was shut away. Because in their world, this was just what families did. So Blanche wasn't sent to an asylum. She was given something worse, a life sentence in her own home, hidden from the world, erased from memory. All while her family went on living their respectable bourgeois lives. March 9th, 1873. Blanche has been in a drug-fueled fog for about 2 years now, when her beloved grandmother, Louise, dies in her sleep at age 70. She's buried in the Poitiers cemetery nearby, and needless to say, Blanche is absolutely devastated. Her grandmother was the only person who gave Blanche the strength and courage to keep fighting for her life against her mother. Now, what happens next sends dear Mama Louise into a freaking spiral. Louise Monnier has just buried her mother, Louise de Monarque, and is probably expecting a big fat check via her mother's will. She is, after all, the only child, but that doesn't happen. Grandma Louise wills 50% to her husband and the other 50% to Blanche. The one person Louise, by all accounts, despises the most is now wealthier than she is. Her own mother just made sure of that. This is the most perfect posthumous checkmate I've ever heard of. Now, I am 100% sure that Blanche was wrought with grief after her beloved grandmother passed. And although Grandma Louise was older in age, she passed in her sleep as opposed to some long, drawn-out illness that would have prepared loved ones for her passing, in some sense. Her death was sudden, unexpected, and Blanche, who, thanks to long-term bromide use, is not in the best mental state anyway, and she isn't handling it all that well. So Louise does what Louise does and takes advantage of the situation. She makes 2 phone calls. First, Louise calls someone to come over and assess Blanche for convent life. Why? Because Blanche has lost her love, Victor, and now her grandmother, arguably the 2 people she loved most in the world. And she tells her mother, Louise, that she just wants to hide away in a convent as a nun and be left alone. But Louise doesn't want Blanche to do this. Before, that would mean losing control over Blanche's life. And now it meant losing control over Blanche's new inherited wealth. So Louise calls in reinforcements, a convent assessor. And not just any assessor, but an experienced nun called the Mistress of Novices. Because becoming a nun back then, it wasn't like filling out an application online. This was a process, a rigorous, no-nonsense evaluation where they picked apart every single aspect of your life. They're looking at your spiritual motivation, your character, your family background, your education level, and of course, they're evaluating your mental and physical health, which is exactly where Blanche falls apart. Because here's the thing. Louise probably doesn't even have to lie at this point. Blanche has been on Bromide for 2 years straight. The damage is done. The effects have taken hold. Her hands shake, her mind is foggy, and she's a shell of who she used to be. So when this Mistress of Novices looks at Blanche and evaluates whether she's suitable for nun life, the answer is no. Of course it's no. Blanche fails the assessment. And just like that, Louise wins again. Blanche's one shot at escape, her one hope of getting out of that house and away from her mother, is crushed. The convent door slams shut, and Blanche is trapped right back where Louise wants her, under her roof and under her control, with absolutely nowhere left to run. So then Louise makes that second phone call. She calls up the same Dr. Garanou and puts on a performance of a lifetime. Doctor, you have to help me. Blanche is hysterical with grief over her grandmother's death. She's completely fallen apart. And does Dr. G ask to see Blanche or examine her? Does he even speak to her or verify any of this? Of course not. He does not. He takes Louise's word as gospel again and diagnoses Blanche with hysteria of grief. I'm not even kidding you. I wish I was making this up. And according to Louise, it's manifesting in all of these destructive behaviors. She's refusing to leave her room. She won't wear any clothes. She's flying into violent rages and throwing objects at people. And let's just pause for a second, because does any of that sound like grief to you? Because even though people will grieve differently, some people will cry for weeks, shut down emotionally, even just like throw themselves into work. But grief doesn't typically involve getting so feral and angry that you are hurling objects at people. It's just not someone mourning their grandmother. That's someone who's been pushed past their absolute breaking point. But Dr. G doesn't question it. He just nods along and tells Louise to keep up with the potassium bromide and the ice baths. Plus, he gives her a new instruction. Lock the bedroom door if you're afraid of her. He literally just gave Louise permission to imprison her own daughter. And that's exactly what Louise does. Here's the part that'll make you want to scream. While Blanche is trapped in 4 walls with no say in anything, Marcel is out there living with complete and total freedom. One of the things Marcel has the freedom to do is defend his doctoral thesis. And the topic of his thesis? The irony of it is just too good to pass over here, so I have to mention it. Marcel stands before a panel to defend his work on complicity in Roman law and French law. As in, when are you responsible for a crime you didn't directly commit? His thesis explores this massive debate among criminologists at the time. On one side, you've got the traditionalists, old school lawyers clinging to centuries-old precedent like their lives depended on it. And to them, the law is fixed, unchanging, and absolute. But then on the other side, you have the modernists, and these are the reformers arguing that law should actually serve justice, guided by reason, fairness, and the needs of society right now, not what worked in ancient Rome. Marcel plants his flag firmly with the modernists. He argues that punishment must be rational and proportional, that you can't automatically declare someone guilty just because they were in the vicinity of a crime. They have to have actively participated. They have to have known what was happening and chosen to enable it. So his position is clear. Proximity doesn't equal guilt. You have to be truly complicit. It's compelling and quite progressive for the time. Plus, it's rooted in logic and humanity, but the irony is that years from now, Marcel will be standing accused of complicity in a crime that shocks the nation. And those academic principles he's defending today, they'll be turned right back on him. Did Marcel know what was happening in his own home? Did he participate? Did he look the other way? And We'll be talking more about this later in part 3. Marcel is also building his future after college. It's October 1873, and he's 25 years old, and he's been appointed as a prefecture counselor in the Lands Department, a clerical position with administrative duties in the public sector. It's a very respectable and good job, and the kind of position that opens doors. 3 months into his new position, Marcel meets someone. Her name is Maria de Los Angeles Francisca Paula Calista Conge. She goes by Angel. Or Angel, not sure. She's young and beautiful and from a noble Spanish family. Her grandfather was a former governor of the Basque province, but she's in France as a refugee because her artillery uncle was in the Civil War. Marcel is smitten, and he wants to send her flowers, but he's too shy, and his friends notice this about him and sends flowers on his behalf. And the card says, "From Marcel." And then they get together after that and make plans to marry. But of course, Louise is against it. Yes, Angel is from a noble family, but she's a foreigner and a refugee, and Louise thinks the marriage is too hasty. But Marcel needs to marry fast because apparently being married gives him more credibility in his position at his job. So his father, Emile, agrees to the marriage because, of course, his eyes are set on getting Marcel into the best school and the perfect job for social standing. And Emile is not going to let anything stand in the way of that. That's been his focus from the beginning. Louise doesn't fight him on it in the end, and I guess her greed for noble family wealth was way stronger than her racism. But Marcel and Angel have to wait to get married. They want a spring wedding, but marriages don't happen in May. May is an unlucky month, and no one would dare get married then. But they need to wait until June 1874 anyway to honor the 1-year mourning period for Grandma Louise. So the wedding is set for June 17th, 1874. And preparation and celebration is in the air. It's beautiful. It's March 12th, 1874, 3 months before the wedding. And Emile writes a letter to the prefect of land, the man who gave Marcel his clerical position. And it's a thank you letter, very polite and very gracious, and the kind of correspondence expected between men of their social standing. But buried in the pleasantries of this letter, "My daughter is not cured of her affliction, nor will she be for a very long time, I fear, but she is quite out of danger. Languor, a desperate languor that is her usual state of health, has now replaced the initial crisis. My wife and I were infinitely touched, Monsieur Prefect, by the part you designed to take regarding our concerns." And we can break that down for a second. Not cured, nor will she be for a very long time. Emile is already preparing people for the fact that Blanche won't be getting better, that this isn't temporary, and that she'll remain in this state indefinitely. She's quite out of danger. Out of danger of what? From herself or the fever or cause of scandal? Languor, a desperate languor, has now replaced the initial crisis. What does that mean? Languor, a fancy word for weakness, lethargy, a lack of vitality. And in other words, he's saying the bromide is working, Blanche isn't fighting anymore, and she's sedated, compliant, and manageable. The initial crisis, her defiance of nakedness at the window and her love for Victor, has been chemically erased at this point, and Emile frames it as progress. My wife and I were infinitely touched. Notice who's doing the work here. My wife and I, not just Louise, both of them. Emile is fully complicit. He's not a passive bystander. He's an active participant in this narrative. And this letter isn't just a thank you note. It's a public alibi. Emile is informing an influential government official, someone with power and someone who knows Marcel, that Blanche is sick. And she's being cared for. But the family is handling it and that everything's under control. If anyone ever asks questions, the prefect of land already knows. He's been briefed. He's part of their concerns. The web of silence just got wider. The day before the wedding, the marriage contract is signed. Marcel and Angel will receive an annual amount of 5,000 francs a year, half paid by his parents, Louise and Emile, and the other half by his grandfather, Louis de Marnac. The arrangement will end if they die, but it'll go on until then. It's supposed to be temporary understanding. Contributions from Angel's family are impossible at this point due to the war in Spain, but once Angel's mother returns to Spain and can access her funds, she'll contribute 2,000 francs a year. Marcel's family will cover the remaining 3,000, and this is important to remember for what happens later on when we talk in part 4. So it's June 17th, 1874, and the year of mourning is over, so Marcel and Angel can finally get married, and it's their special day. Blanche actually attends the wedding, but she's wearing a poorly fitted pink and gray dress, which highlights her darkened eyes and pale complexion, and even really kind of made her look like a ghost. Louise wouldn't let anyone take Blanche's measurements for a properly fitted dress. First of all, she wouldn't care to spend the money, and more importantly, Louise does not want anyone seeing where Blanche lives, right? Or how she's living. But the guests noticed right away, because Blanche is making these sudden strange gestures, trying to catch flies with her hands and speaking to the air. No one in particular. Her gaze is unfocused. She's randomly crying. She can't stand up straight. And men, they do try to dance with her. She declines them all. And later on, the guests would describe her as eccentric. And there was even a doctor there that witnessed Blanche's condition himself. And several people came to him in distress afterward to tell about their concerns. And they were disturbed by what they saw. Most likely, Louise had Blanche attend the wedding to keep up appearances, to show that what Louise had been saying all along is true, right? Louise is doing everything she could, but look at her poor daughter. Look how ill she is. And Emile gave the prefect his alibi, and now Louise is giving hers at the wedding, and so it's working. Everyone saw just how sick Blanche was, and everyone pitied Louise and the martyred mother, for caring for her daughter no matter how difficult it was. Louise got everything she wanted at this point, respect and sympathy and the image of a devoted mother and family. Marcel got what he wanted, the respect of the community, a good job, the wife, and Emile, he's doing what he does best, just sitting in the passenger seat as an accomplice while Louise dives this whole freaking nightmare forward. But Blanche, any reference to Marcel's wedding after that day for years caused her to burst into tears. Marcel's wedding could very well be the turning point in this story, because this is the moment Louise has now gotten everything she wants. Everyone knows who Marcel is. Emile has prestige in the community. They both bring honor to the family. Louise looks like the devoted, martyred mother, grieving her own mother's death while caring for her sick daughter, and still managing to get Blanche to the wedding no matter what. And now that the wedding is over, Marcel and Angel will honeymoon in Paris, and Blanche will be returned to the attic. Back to the darkness, back to the drugs, back to the slow erasure of everything she once was and could be. Over these first 2 parts, we've crept through the first 25 years of Blanche's life, and we've taken our time because we needed to thoroughly understand her world, and more importantly, the suffocating darkness that her mother Louise cast over every single part of it. We've seen what led up to Blanche's intentional health crisis, orchestrated by her own mother. And we've watched Louise get the green light from doctors, society, and from everyone around her to imprison her own daughter in a tiny attic room to maintain total control over her life. But here's the thing. We've only scratched the surface of what is about to happen. In part 3, we're going to step inside that locked room. And I need you to prepare yourself, because what Blanche Monnier endured for the next decades of her life isn't just tragic, it's medieval. It's the kind of suffering that makes you question how a human body can survive when everything around you is designed to destroy it. But we know Blanche to be a fighter. So join me in part 3, because the horrors of this story, they are not in the past yet, and they're about to get so much worse. À la prochaine. See you next time.